The Texas sun hung low over the livestock pens, casting long, dry shadows across the dust-choked ground. In the heart of the market square, where cattle bellowed and boots clattered against wood planks, Caleb Monroe stood quietly beside a holding fence, one hand resting on a saddle worn by years and heat. He hadn't come for trouble. He'd driven over 40 miles for a gelding he'd heard about: solid build, calm under pressure, suitable for long cattle drives. But as he waited for the auctioneer to arrive, a different noise caught his attention. Not the typical bartering or horse calls, but something rougher, tense voices rising, a crowd shifting, the air thick with discomfort. Caleb turned toward the disturbance. A man, rail-thin and swaying with the stink of liquor, was hauling a young girl across the open pen by a rope tied around her wrists. Her dress was torn at the hem, feet bare, face streaked with dust. She didn't cry, didn't scream, just walked where she was pulled, silent as stone. The man barked at the crowd, slurring his offer. "She's deaf, can't talk neither, but strong, eats little cheaper than a mule." A few bystanders laughed nervously. Most just turned away, but Caleb didn't. There was something in the girl's eyes that arrested him. Not fear exactly, not even pleading, just a stillness, a kind of inner hush that pushed past the noise around them. Her eyes met his only for a second, and in that second, he felt as though she could see all the way through him. Caleb had known silence, the kind that fills a cabin after a wife's funeral, the kind that stretches across the prairie at night when no one's left to say your name. But this girl didn't carry silence like a burden. She wore it like armor. The drunk man kept yelling, tried tying the girl to the post near a skittish colt. "You'll get 2 for the price of 1 girl," and horsemore laughter. A spitball from a boy. Caleb stepped forward. "How much?" The man blinked at him, then grinned, mistaking kindness for weakness. "You got 40 for the filly and another 20 for the girl. She's yours." Caleb didn't barter. He pulled the bills from his coat, handed them over, and cut the rope from the girl's wrists without a word. The girl didn't flinch. She just stood beside him, waiting. He handed the reins of the colt to a nearby boy and placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder, guiding her away from the crowd, away from the man who was already stumbling toward the whiskey tent. As they walked, Caleb realized she was limping slightly, favoring her right ankle. Still, she made no sound. He brought her home that evening. The ride was long and quiet, the colt trailing behind, the girl riding beside him on his old mule. He offered her water at the halfway mark. She took it with both hands, drank deeply, then looked at him, not to speak but to acknowledge. He realized she understood more than he could guess. Back at the ranch, he made space for her in the small storage room off the kitchen. It wasn't much, just a cot, a quilt, and a lantern, but it was warm, and hers. She examined the room, touched the quilt, then sat cross-legged on the cot and folded her hands in her lap. Not a word. The next morning, he rose before dawn, expecting to work alone. But she was already outside, pulling water from the well. By mid-morning, she'd fed the chickens, cleaned the porch, and was gently brushing the filly he'd bought the day before. Caleb watched from a distance, uncertain how to thank someone who never spoke. Instead, he just nodded. She nodded back. As the days passed, the girl whom he began calling Clara fell into the rhythm of ranch life without needing instruction. She seemed to read his mind. If he saddled the horse, she fetched the bridle. If he chopped firewood, she stacked it. If he coughed, a cup of warm tea appeared on the table minutes later. Caleb never asked how she knew so much. Some things just were. Word of the girl spread. Folks in town were curious, then skeptical, then suspicious. Some whispered that she was strange, maybe touched. Others said she was cursed, a bad omen brought in by a lonely man with too much land and too little sense. One Sunday, after supplies, a group of men followed Caleb out of the general store. They spoke plainly, their boots stiff with judgment. "She's not right," one said. "Might be dangerous." Caleb turned to face them, jaw tight. "She's the only soul I've met who knows how to listen." He didn't wait for a reply, just climbed onto his wagon and drove off. Behind him, the men grumbled, but did not follow. Back at the ranch, Clara was tending to a wounded calf, wrapping its leg with strips of linen she had boiled clean. Caleb watched her from the fence. His anger faded. All that remained was wonder. In a world built on noise and shouting and ownership, this girl moved like wind over grass, soft, steady, unclaimed. He began to leave books around the house, open to pages with simple pictures. One day he found a drawing she'd made beside his plate, 2 hands, signing thank you. His heart caught in his chest. She wasn't deaf, or at least, not entirely. She was listening in her own way. That evening, he signed back, clumsily. Her smile was slight, but real. And so it began a new kind of conversation. Not with mouths, but with movement, glance, gesture, a language older than words. Caleb didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in many winters, he wasn't afraid to find out. The days passed quietly on the ranch, and though Clara never spoke, her presence grew more certain with each sunrise. There was something about her that moved like wind through tall grass, unseen but always felt. She did not gesture. She did not write. She never once attempted to explain herself. And yet, somehow, Caleb always understood her, or at least, he came to trust that she understood everything around her, often more than he did. It started with the animals. The horses, usually skittish around strangers, let her near without flinching. The dog, who had snapped at every farmhand Caleb ever hired, laid his head in Clara's lap after only a day. She walked into the barn one morning and placed her hand gently on the flank of a cow that had been restless all night. The creature calmed instantly. Eyes half closed in relief, Caleb had watched from the doorway, silent, struck not by the act itself but by the ease with which she performed it. He noticed other things too. She always seemed to know when the weather would turn. On a day so bright it hurt the eyes, she hung laundry only inside the lean-to, shielding it from a sky that gave no hint of rain. That afternoon, thunder cracked without warning, and rain poured for half an hour. The only dry clothes on the ranch were hers. She had a way of appearing wherever she was needed. Never hurried, never lost. Once, Caleb had dropped a wooden beam on his boot while repairing a corral gate. He'd winced, bit back a curse, and before he could sit down, Clara was already beside him, handing him a cold cloth wrapped around a sprig of mint. He never saw her approach. She never asked what happened. She simply knew. Caleb tried, at first, to teach her things, not out of pity but out of habit. He'd point to tools, to tasks, explaining in slow, measured words even though he didn't know what she could hear or understand. But she would often step in and finish the job before he could begin. One morning, he set out to mend a fence along the east pasture. When he arrived, she was already there, hammering a nail with steady hands, the wire taut and perfect. He stopped trying after that. She needed no instruction, only space. Their unspoken rhythm settled into something like routine, though Caleb would never call it that. It was too fluid, too alive. They shared meals in silence, she always waiting for him to take the first bite. She cleaned with care but never touched his belongings unless they were left out too long. He came to realize that the house felt more like a home now, not because of noise or conversation, but because she was in it. And yet, there was still the mystery of her silence. Caleb had grown used to it. But he couldn't help wondering, was it choice? Was it trauma or something else entirely? She showed no fear, no hesitation. She was never startled, never withdrawn. She watched everything with clear eyes and responded only when it mattered. Once, he caught her staring at the hills beyond the barn for a long time, unmoving, like she was listening to something the earth itself was saying. When he stepped up beside her, she turned and nodded once before walking back toward the house. He never asked what she had heard. Clara also seemed to carry a sense of timing that Caleb found both uncanny and comforting. When he returned from town, dusty and tired, She had hot coffee waiting. When he woke early with a nightmare he couldn't remember, she was already stirring the fire. It wasn't that she was trying to please him, there was no trace of that in her. She simply lived as if her instincts were perfectly aligned with the needs around her. It humbled him. And then there were the small moments that stayed with him longer than they should. The way she brushed her hand across the porch rail when it creaked, and the next morning, it had been sanded smooth. The way she once moved a pot of stew off the fire seconds before it boiled over, without ever glancing at it. Or the time she pulled him by the coat collar away from a barn beam just before it crashed down in a windstorm. She saved his life that day, and never looked at him any differently for it. Still, he tried not to read too much into her silence. People had their reasons. Caleb had his own. Once. The years had stripped his voice of much desire for talking. But being around Clara reminded him that understanding didn't always require words, that maybe words weren't always the truest way of knowing someone. He remembered watching his father patch fence posts while his mother hummed in the garden. They had spoken little, but their love had filled the land they shared. With Clara, it was something like that, only quieter, deeper. Sometimes he would catch her watching the horizon, eyes soft, as if waiting for something that had not yet arrived. He never asked what. Maybe it was a habit from another life, or maybe it was just part of her way, but it made him ache in a place he'd buried for years. He found himself doing things he hadn't done in ages. He fixed the broken gate to the north pasture, cleaned out the old shed, mended the torn lace curtains in the kitchen. Not for her, for them. She still hadn't spoken, and maybe she never would. But there were nights now when he'd hear her moving through the house, footsteps gentle, like she was checking the windows, adjusting the fire, making sure everything was right. On those nights, Caleb slept easier. The ranch was the same as it had always been, hard, dusty, and full of wind, but it no longer felt empty. He couldn't explain it to anyone, and he didn't need to. Whatever Clara carried in her silence, it wasn't loneliness, it was presence. A fullness of being that made everything around her more vivid, more alive. Caleb didn't know what she had lost before arriving at his gate, or what she had run from, but he knew she had found something here. So had he. Without a single word spoken, the rhythm of life on the ranch had changed in quiet ways since Clara arrived. Caleb couldn't name when it began to shift. Only that one morning he looked out across the pasture and realized things felt more alive, more tended to. It wasn't that she made grand gestures or took over tasks. She simply moved through the world with quiet certainty, fitting herself into the fabric of his life as though she'd always belonged there. She didn't ask questions, didn't need instruction, and never hesitated. She learned by watching. She worked with purpose. And over time, Caleb noticed he no longer thought of her as someone he'd rescued. She had become part of the place, rooted in the same soil as the trees and the worn fences. He watched her in the mornings, how she walked the perimeter of the barn before the sun rose, how the horses responded to her presence with ease. She mended what needed mending, often before he even knew something was broken. One afternoon, he returned from a trip into town and found the chicken coop reinforced with new wire. He hadn't asked. She hadn't said a word. But the last raccoon had gotten in just 2 nights prior, and somehow she had known what to do. It was like that with everything. She saw the need before it was spoken. The neighbors still talked, of course. Some were polite enough, nodding in town when they saw the two of them. Others weren't so kind. Rumors swirled about a girl who didn't speak, who'd been sold like property. A few muttered that Caleb had lost his mind, taking in a stranger with no past and no voice. But Caleb had spent a lifetime ignoring gossip. He'd buried 2 brothers to violence, a father to whiskey, and a mother to grief. He'd walked alone for so long the noise of other people's opinions sounded like wind through dead leaves there. But meaningless. Clara didn't seem to care either. If she heard the whispers, she never showed it. Her days were filled with movement cooking, tending to the animals, repairing what she could. But what struck Caleb most was how she seemed to understand him in ways that unnerved and comforted him at once. There were days he didn't speak at all, days when old guilt weighed heavy on his chest. On those days, Clara never pressed him, never hovered. But she'd leave his coffee just a little warmer, sweep the porch twice instead of once, or bring out a slice of bread with honey just before dusk. It wasn't charity. It wasn't duty. It was something else in awareness, a kind of seeing beyond what was visible. Caleb began to notice how often she stood near the west fence, the one overlooking the wide ridge where the land turned to shadow in the late afternoon. That fence bordered the property he'd inherited through blood, not purchase. His grandfather had taken it with a rifle and 2 men at his back. That land had never felt right under his boots, like it belonged to a wound instead of a family. Caleb rarely walked it anymore, though he paid taxes and kept the boundary lines. But Clara would pause there sometimes, hand resting on the old wood, eyes distant. She never stepped past it. Somehow, he felt she understood what that land meant, what it cost. One evening, after weeks of silence, Caleb found her in the barn long after dark, lighting a lantern and checking on a calf that had been born weak. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her move with calm precision. When she finally noticed him, she didn't startle. She simply nodded and went back to her work. Caleb stepped closer. The calf was breathing steady now, its small frame curled in straw, warm and safe. Clara touched its side gently, then looked up at him. He opened his mouth to speak, unsure what words would come, but she raised a hand slightly, not to stop him, but to say, "I understand." And he believed she did. Not just about the calf and about everything, about why he kept an extra bottle of whiskey under the sink but never touched it, about the way he avoided the drawer with the letters, about the hesitation in his step every time he walked past the old shed where his father used to work. She knew. Somehow, without ever being told, from that moment, something between them settled deeper. There was no confession, no declaration, just the acknowledgement that they had found something rare, understanding without demand. Clara earned her place on the ranch not because he gave it to her, but because she claimed it quietly. Day by day, with hands that healed and eyes that listened, Caleb stopped waiting for her to speak. He no longer wondered if she ever would. Her silence was not empty. It was full of knowing. They began to share more in small ways. She started leaving notes, single words or drawings on scraps of paper folded beside his plate. Fence, rain, wind. Sometimes he wrote back. Sometimes he didn't have to. The unspoken bond grew with the season, and the house that once echoed with loss began to feel lived in again. Not because it was filled with noise, but because it was full of presence. One night, as the fire crackled low, Caleb sat across from Clara at the table. Outside, the wind stirred but didn't howl. He looked at her, not with questions, but with something closer to peace, and she met his gaze with quiet steadiness, as if to say, "This is enough." And for the first time in years, he agreed. Whispers began long before the first accusation. In a small town nestled between wind-blown plains and dry creek beds, silence was suspicious. People noticed things quickly: who came into town, who left without buying, who didn't speak when spoken to. So when Clara walked the dirt path behind Caleb Monroe, week after week, eyes down and voice absent, the murmurs grew. At first it was simple curiosity. A man like Caleb had always been alone, hard and quiet as the land he worked. Then he showed up at the feed store with a girl who never smiled, never spoke, and watched everything like she already knew what would happen next. The folks behind the counter raised their brows, but said nothing, not out loud. They wondered who she was, where she came from, why she looked through people instead of at them. Some said she must have been stolen. Others thought she'd been dropped off by one of those traveling faith healers who roamed through Texas with tents and strange scriptures. A few of the older women whispered that a girl who never spoke might be hiding a devil's tongue, Caleb heard none of this at first. He didn't go into town for talk. He came for tools and supplies, and once in a while to post a letter he never expected an answer to. But over time, even he could feel it, the pause in conversation when they walked past, the eyes that didn't blink fast enough, the growing space between them and the rest of the world. Clara noticed too. She had always been alert to shifts in breath, to the tremble of silence before noise. She kept close to the shelves, stood with her back to walls, touched nothing she didn't intend to buy. It didn't help. They stared anyway. Children pointed, and their mothers pulled them close. Shopkeepers counted change too slowly, watching her fingers like they expected them to reach for something they shouldn't. She never flinched, never looked away. But at night, when they returned to the ranch, she stayed up later than usual, sitting near the fire, unmoving. Her hands curled tightly in her lap. Caleb tried to ignore it, to let the noise pass like dust in the wind. He told himself that people had always feared what they didn't understand, that time would wear down their suspicion. But time didn't move like it used to. It piled on itself, heavy with judgment. The whispers turned into questions, then questions turned into warnings. One Sunday morning, a rancher named Bill Cutler stopped him outside the blacksmith shop. Bill's hat was tilted too low, his eyes narrow, like he was ashamed of what he came to say. He cleared his throat and spoke low. "Folks are nervous. Caleb, that girl of yours, she gives folks the chills. Never says a word, stares like she's read your sins." Caleb's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. Bill continued, shifting on his boots. "Some of the boys, they think maybe she's not right. Maybe she's got something unnatural in her." He didn't wait for an answer, just tipped his hat and walked away, leaving a silence colder than any wind. 2 days later, the barn door was found half open. Inside, the feed barrels had been overturned, and strange symbols scratched into the wooden wall with a piece of coal. Caleb didn't believe in curses, but he knew cowardice when he saw it. Someone had come in the night, not to steal, but to send a message. Clara stood beside him, staring at the marks. Her face was still, unreadable. She reached up with a bucket of water and scrubbed the wood clean without a word. That night, he locked every door. The following morning, he hitched the wagon and took her into town anyway. He wasn't about to let fear keep her from the life she had built. They bought flour, nails, and lamp oil. At the mercantile, the silence thickened as they entered. A group of men stood near the back wall, voices low, arms crossed. One of them stepped forward, Jonas Rudd, a man who owned 300 head of cattle and thought that made him king of the plains. His face was flushed, voice louder than it needed to be. "She shouldn't be here. Caleb, people are uneasy. Things been happening since she came." His eyes flicked to Clara, who stood behind Caleb, hands folded, gaze steady. Caleb looked at Jonas, slow and steady. "Things been happening long before her. Jonas, maybe you just started noticing." Jonas stepped closer. "You think it's right bringing someone like that into town, a girl who never talks? Folks say she watches the dead when she walks through the cemetery. That animals follow her. That she knew about the fire at Brantley's place before it happened." Caleb didn't blink. "And what if she did?" Jonas hesitated, searching for something to say, "and then maybe she caused it." The words hung in the air. No one spoke. Clara didn't move. Her eyes never left Jonas's face. Caleb took a step forward, voice low and sure. "You're afraid of her because she doesn't give you what you expect. She doesn't explain herself. She doesn't ask your permission to be who she is. And that terrifies you." Someone in the back muttered, and another nodded. The crowd began to shift. "Not in Clara's favor. We're asking you," Jonas said, "kindly for now to send her away. Before things get worse." Caleb's voice was firm. "I didn't ask for your kindness, and she's not going anywhere." He took Clara's hand not forcefully but clearly, and turned to leave. As they walked out into the afternoon sun, the silence behind them wasn't empty. It was brimming with fear and resentment, and something darker beneath. Back at the ranch, he didn't speak of what happened. Clara didn't ask. That night, as the firelight flickered against the walls, he found her sitting near the window, staring out into the dark. He walked over, placed a blanket across her shoulders, and sat beside her. No words were spoken, but the bond between them deepened. Not out of defiance, but out of the quiet, steady truth that they had already chosen each other, and neither fear nor foolishness would break that. The sun sat low over the town square, drawing long shadows across the ground as the air thickened with tension. Caleb had been called there by a knock on his gate just after dawn, a messenger from the town council asking him to come into town and speak on the matter. He knew what matter they meant. He'd seen it coming like a slow-moving storm, rumors growing sharper, glances turning colder. And now, this, as he rode into town with Clara seated beside him in the wagon. He felt the weight of something inevitable pressing down. She didn't ask questions. She never did. She simply sat with her hands resting quietly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon. When they reached the edge of town, the crowd was already gathered. Men with calloused hands and sun-worn faces stood alongside women in faded bonnets, their mouths tight with suspicion. A few of the younger ones carried tools, shovels, pitchforks, things they'd grabbed without thinking. It wasn't yet a mob, but it could become one with the wrong words. Caleb helped Clara down from the wagon and walked with her toward the center of the crowd. No one greeted them. No one stepped aside. They just stood, eyes narrowed, waiting for someone else to speak first. At the front of the group stood Jonas Rudd, the cattleman who had always mistaken volume for authority. He stepped forward, arms crossed, voice loud enough to carry across the square. "We asked you, Caleb, kindly. We gave you time to reconsider." Caleb said nothing. Jonas gestured toward Clara. "She doesn't belong here. She's not one of us. She walks around like she sees things no one else sees. Animals follow her. Fires break out and she's always nearby. Folks are scared. They've got children to protect." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered a prayer. A woman crossed herself. Jonas continued, "We've lived on this land a long time. Caleb, we've buried kin here, built our homes with our hands, and we know the difference between what's right and what ain't. That girl of yours, she brings something dark." Caleb glanced at Clara. She stood still, not shrinking, not cowering, just watching. Her eyes held the same calm they always did, as if none of this surprised her, as if she'd seen it all before. Caleb stepped forward. His voice was low, even, but it carried in the still air. "You say she's not one of you. That's true. She doesn't gossip in your shops, doesn't go to your church. She doesn't tell you what you want to hear, but she's done more good in this town than half the folks standing here." There was a pause. Someone coughed. She helped birth the Lambert twins when their mother was too scared to ask for help. She sat with old Mr. Green for 6 hours while he died, because his own family didn't come. She found the Wilson boy when he wandered off near the river, brought him back without saying a word. A flicker of recognition passed over a few faces. "You call her strange because she doesn't talk," Caleb went on. "But maybe you're the ones who've forgotten how to listen. She sees what's needed and does it, without asking for thanks, without expecting praise. She's the only person I've ever met who truly listens, not with ears, but with her soul." Clara didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The words settled around her like a blanket. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Jonas stepped forward again, voice brittle. "You love her, don't you?" Caleb looked at him, steady. "Yes, I do." Jonas's mouth opened as if to argue, but nothing came out. He turned back to the crowd, searching for support. But the tide had shifted. People who had stood tall before now looked uncertain. A woman near the front lowered her eyes. A ranch hand rubbed the back of his neck. The energy had changed. Suspicion no longer had fuel. The pitchfork stayed pointed at the ground. Jonas muttered something under his breath and walked away, boots kicking up dust with each angry step. The rest of the crowd lingered, unsure what came next, then began to drift apart, scattering like dry leaves. Some avoided eye contact. A few nodded at Caleb as they passed. No one said another word. When the square had emptied, Caleb turned to Clara. She hadn't moved. She looked at him with the same calm she'd worn since the first day he met her. But now, beneath the stillness, there was something else. A quiet knowing. Gratitude not for the words he'd spoken, but for the truth behind them. He offered his hand. She took it. They walked back to the wagon together. The air felt lighter now. Though the heat of the day was just beginning, Caleb helped her up, climbed in beside her, and took the reins. The horse stepped forward, and they rode in silence out of the town that had just barely decided not to turn on them. It hadn't been a victory, not in the way people like to count them, but it had been enough to stay, enough to keep building. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Clara lit the lantern by the window. Caleb sat on the porch, the dog at his feet. The ranch was quiet, peaceful. The wind moved through the grass, gentle and steady. Inside, Clara set 2 cups on the table and waited. Caleb joined her, and they sat across from each other in the soft glow. Not speaking, not needing to. Everything worth saying had already been heard. The first change came quietly, without announcement or ceremony. One morning, a boy went missing from the Fletcher homestead. He was 6 years old, fond of wandering, and had last been seen chasing a strayed dog toward the woods near the South Creek. By nightfall, the town had formed a search party, men fanning out with lanterns and rifles, calling the boy's name through the brush. Hours passed with no sign, and panic began to swell. Caleb Monroe was among the searchers, boots heavy with mud and mind weighed down by memory. He returned home near midnight, exhausted and empty-handed, only to find Clara standing on the porch, fully dressed, waiting. She didn't ask. She simply walked past him, barefoot, into the darkness. He called out, asked where she was going, but she only raised her hand slightly and kept walking. Against his better judgment, he followed. She moved with purpose, not fast but sure, as if the ground itself was whispering directions. They crossed fields and narrow footpaths, down into the hollows where the air grew damp and the trees bent low. Then, without hesitation, Clara dropped to her knees near a cluster of wild grasses and pushed aside the brush. The boy was there, curled against the base of a tree, shivering but safe, a small dog asleep beside him. By morning, the news had spread. The townspeople didn't know what to make of it. Some still whispered about curses and unnatural senses, but others began to look at Clara with something different unease. Yes, but also a strange, reluctant awe. She had done what none of them could. She had found the child without a word on Silam, without a map, without needing to ask a single question. Days later, an older woman named Maybelle had a fall in her garden, breaking her hip and leaving her unable to move. Clara arrived without invitation. She bathed Maybelle's face, calmed her breathing, and stayed with her until help arrived. When asked later how she'd known, Clara only placed her hand over her chest and gave a small nod. People began to speak of her not as a threat, but as a mystery of a gentler kind. Still odd, still distant, but no longer someone to fear. Then came the day of the fire. Lightning struck the Harper barn during a storm, and by the time the clouds passed, smoke billowed up over the ridge. Neighbors rushed to help. But by the time they arrived, the worst had passed. What they found instead was Clara standing barefoot in the ash. The Harper's goats gathered calmly behind her, unharmed. She had carried each one out by hand, soot-streaked and soaked to the skin. When Mrs. Harper wept into her apron, Clara took her hand, held it for a long moment, and then quietly walked away. She never waited to be thanked. Word continued to spread, not in grand tales, but in hushed accounts passed from porch to porch. The girl who had once been seen as strange now became something else entirely. Reverence crept in, not through miracles or sermons, but through consistency. Clara showed up when it mattered. She said nothing and did everything. She planted flowers outside the schoolhouse one morning before anyone else arrived. She repaired the broken latch on the church door without ever setting foot inside. She brought fresh bread to a widower who hadn't spoken to anyone since his wife died, then sat with him in silence while he wept. The townsfolk began to nod when she passed. A few even smiled. Children no longer hid behind their mother's skirts but waved shyly. And Clara, unchanged in her quiet, accepted none of it with pride or disdain. She remained exactly who she had always been. Only now, they saw it. Caleb watched it all unfold with a quiet satisfaction. He never sought credit, never claimed her actions as extensions of his own. In truth, he felt humbled by her. There were moments when he looked at Clara and wondered if he'd ever truly known someone before her. She taught without teaching, gave without explanation, and the more the town leaned toward her, the more he realized just how much she had changed the air they all breathed. One morning, Clara stood at the edge of the cemetery, hands clasped loosely in front of her. A small group had gathered, grievers laying flowers, a pastor with a cracked Bible, a mother clutching the folded cloth of a soldier's uniform. Clara said nothing, but when she moved forward to kneel beside a freshly dug grave and place a carved wooden figure on the headstone, no one interrupted. The gesture needed no words. Those watching felt it settle into them, something unspoken yet deeply understood. By the time summer deepened and the fields turned gold with heat, Clara had become a fixture, not the kind you spoke about often, but the kind you noticed when absent. If a door squeaked, she had likely oiled the hinge. If a dog wandered too far, she was the one who brought it home. If someone fell ill, she appeared at the edge of their porch with clean cloth and a steady gaze. No one could say when she had earned this place, only that it felt as if she'd always belonged. And though Caleb said little of it, he felt a quiet pride in watching it happen. He remembered the first time he saw her tethered like livestock, eyes unreadable, and he marveled at the woman she had become. Not through speeches or defense, not through force or persuasion, but through an endless patient offering of presence, the kind of presence that healed not by curing but by simply refusing to leave. So when people spoke her name now, they did so gently. Some still whispered, but the tone had shifted. Reverence had replaced suspicion. Where once they saw a mystery they feared, now they saw something they couldn't quite explain but no longer wanted to. Clara had become something rare, something enduring. Not a miracle, just a woman. And somehow that was more powerful than anything else she could have been. Love didn't announce itself at the Monroe Ranch. It didn't arrive with fireworks or grand gestures, and it certainly never asked for permission. It grew in the quiet places, between early mornings and long silences, between the passing of salt across the table and the way Clara placed his hat just so on the peg near the door. Caleb hadn't planned for anything more than company, a shared roof, a steady rhythm. But days turned into seasons and something deeper took root between them, something that asked for no name but could be felt in every corner of the house. It began with glances, the kind that lingered just long enough to say, "I see you." Then came the small exchanges, fingers brushing against each other while hanging laundry. The way she waited until he'd finished eating before she cleared her plate. How he always poured a second cup of coffee whether she drank it or not. He started reading her movements like he read the sky before a storm. Not with words, but with an understanding that came from time and attentiveness. Clara, too, began to let herself rest in his presence. She had always been still, composed, but now there was something different in the way she moved around him, an ease that came from being seen without being asked to explain. She began teaching him bits of sign language. Slowly at first, he fumbled, clumsy with his fingers but determined. She corrected him gently, never laughing, only smiling when he got it right. He learned how to ask if she was hungry, how to say good morning, how to sign thank you. She showed him how to shape his hands into meaning, and in return he showed her how to ride. At first she was hesitant with the horse, unsure of the reins, stiff in the saddle. But Caleb was patient. He walked beside her, one hand on the bridle, the other ready to catch her if she slipped. She never did. Within weeks, She rode with a quiet confidence, hair pulled back, eyes fixed ahead, as though she'd always known how to move with the rhythm of the land. They would ride together along the ridge, sometimes for hours, saying nothing. The silence was never empty. It was full of things they didn't need to speak aloud. The house changed, too. Clara brought little touches, fresh herbs drying near the window, polished stones lined up along the sill, quilts stitched with care and quiet hands. Caleb found himself tending the garden with more interest, patching the roof before it even leaked, fixing the fence before it leaned too far. Their days settled into a pattern of care, not just for the land, but for each other. When he returned from long rides, she'd have warm bread waiting. When her hands ached from work, he rubbed them without a word. One night, a storm rolled in fierce and sudden. Lightning split the sky and wind howled through the eaves. Caleb lit every lantern and checked every shutter. But Clara didn't seem afraid. She stood by the window, watching the rain fall in sheets, her face calm. When he approached, she turned and signed, "It will pass." He nodded, and they stood side by side until the thunder faded. Afterward, he found her seated near the fireplace, fingers moving in slow, deliberate patterns. She was signing more than just words now. She was telling stories of childhood, of fear, of dreams not yet spoken. Caleb listened with his eyes, memorizing each motion like a verse of scripture. He began signing back, sometimes in full sentences, sometimes just fragments. Their conversations became richer, deeper, shaped not by urgency but by trust. They laughed more, small and quiet at first, then freer as the months stretched on. One afternoon, as they mended a broken fence together, Clara signed something new. "You feel like home." Caleb paused, looked at her, and signed back, "You are mine." There were no rings exchanged, no preacher's words, no papers filed at the courthouse, but from that moment on, there was no question between them. The house became theirs. The land, too. They made decisions together, worked side by side, weathered illness and bad crops without blame. When the dog died, she buried him beneath the apple tree and placed a smooth stone at the base. When Caleb took a fall and cracked a rib, she stayed up every night for a week, placing cool cloths on his brow and whispering prayers in the language of her hands. They never spoke of the past, not in detail. Whatever came before belonged to another life. This life was theirs, simple, shared, and sacred in its own quiet way. Friends and neighbors noticed the bond between them, the way they moved in tandem, the way he always looked for her first in a crowded room, how she smiled a little more easily when he was near. No one questioned it anymore. Love had made its presence known without ever raising its voice. In the evenings, they sat on the porch watching the sun melt into the horizon. Sometimes she signed old poems. Sometimes he hummed a tune his mother used to sing. On one such evening, as fireflies blinked in the tall grass and the air smelled of dust and pine, Clara took his hand and signed, "I never needed words." Caleb brought her fingers to his lips and answered, "I've heard you all along." And that was the truth of it. Their love was not built on declarations or promises shouted into the wind. It was woven into the fabric of their days, quiet and strong, like the threads of a well-used blanket, familiar, comforting, and always there. The morning began like any other. The sun rose over the distant hills in muted gold, bathing the land in warmth and quiet promise. Birds stirred in the cottonwoods near the creek. Caleb sat on the porch, sipping his coffee, the dog asleep at his feet. From inside the house came the soft sounds of movement. Clara setting the kettle, folding a towel, opening a window. These were the sounds that had come to define his days, not loud or demanding, but steady and alive. She had been with him for years now, moving through each day with quiet grace, shaping the house into something more than shelter, into a home. Their lives had become a rhythm, a kind of music only they could hear. They didn't need words. They had gestures, glances, the language of hands and hearts. In the evenings, they spoke in signs by firelight. In the mornings, They communicated with routines so familiar neither had to ask. When he was tired, she brought a blanket. When she was sad, he brewed her favorite tea. They had never said it aloud, never needed to. But love lived in the space between them like a silent hymn. That morning, however, something shifted. Caleb had risen early to tend to a calf born in the night. The birth had been difficult, the air still heavy with sweat and straw and the lingering ache of life hard-earned. Clara had been there, steady and calm, wiping the calf's muzzle, helping the mother to her feet. Afterward, they'd return to the house in silence, hands smeared with work, hearts light with relief. Caleb went to the porch, coffee in hand, ready to greet the day with the quiet he had come to cherish. Clara came out moments later. She held a small bowl of blackberries, fresh from the vine. She set them beside him and stood quietly, her fingers curled into her palms as if bracing against something unseen. Caleb looked up, sensing the change in her, something taut and unspoken beneath her stillness. He reached out, brushed his fingers lightly across her wrist. She looked at him, eyes wide but steady. Then, she opened her mouth. "I do not need sound," she said, voice fragile, unsure, barely more than breath. "Only you." The words were soft, shaped like something unfamiliar, as if they had waited years to be formed. But they were real, spoken, heard. Caleb's chest tightened, not with surprise but with something deeper, awe, reverence. He rose slowly, stepping closer, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. He looked into her eyes, seeing the tremble there not of fear but of release. Something long held had finally been let go. "I hear you," he said, voice low and steady. "Always have." Her eyes filled then, but she didn't look away. He brushed her cheek with his thumb, the way he always did when words felt too small. But this time, the silence between them held a new weight. Not absence, fulfillment. They stood there for a long time, surrounded by the quiet of the land they had built together. The dog stirred and wagged its tail once, as if sensing the shift. The wind carried the scent of honeysuckle and hay. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed, late and proud, but none of it mattered in that moment. Only the sound of her voice, uncertain but brave, and the reply that met it like an open door. Later that day, they returned to their work. Clara didn't speak again, not out of fear or doubt, but because the words had done their work. She had said what needed saying, and he had answered not just with his mouth but with his whole being. There was nothing more to explain. In the days that followed, things continued as before, but with a tenderness woven deeper into everything. When they sat at the table, she reached for his hand without thinking. When he passed her in the kitchen, he brushed her shoulder gently. A habit now. A promise without needing to be spoken. Their signs continued. Their routines remained, but there was a lightness to their silences now, as if something had been unburdened. On the third night, as they sat beneath the stars, Clara signed slowly, remembering the shape of her voice. Caleb nodded, watching her hands, then her lips. She spoke again, only once. Just his name. It came out like a breath, like wind across a wheat field, familiar and holy. "Caleb," he looked at her, eyes soft. "Yes." She smiled. That was enough. They didn't become different people because of it. She still preferred gestures, still moved quietly through their home, still listened to the world with a kind of sacred attention. He still found more comfort in the weight of his hands than the noise of town. But something in them had deepened. The bond that had always lived in silence had now been spoken into the world, and in doing so, had grown stronger. In time, others noticed the shift. The people who once whispered now greeted them with warmth. The baker handed Clara an extra loaf. The school teacher waved as they passed. No one asked questions. They didn't need to. Whatever had passed between them was private, but its glow touched everything around them. Years later, when neighbors told stories of the couple on the Monroe Ranch, they didn't speak of how she'd once been thought strange or how he'd once been feared for his solitude. They spoke of how she'd found her voice not by force, but through trust, of how he'd answered not with declarations but with presence, of how their love never needed to be shouted to be understood. They were remembered not for what they said, but for how they lived with honesty, with tenderness, and with a kind of quiet that held the world together. In the years that followed Clara's arrival at the Monroe Ranch, the town shifted in ways no one could have predicted. It didn't happen overnight, and it didn't begin with the adults. It began with the children. They were the first to see her not with suspicion, but with wonder. Maybe it was because children had not yet learned to fear what was different, or maybe it was because Clara never looked at them with judgment. She watched them with soft eyes and quiet interest, and they responded not with fear but with curiosity. It started with one girl, Sarah Jennings, who wandered too far from her mother at the market and ended up sitting on the steps of the general store, crying softly. Clara had seen her from across the street and walked over without hesitation. She knelt beside her, brushed her hair gently behind her ear, and without speaking, began to draw shapes in the dust with her fingertip circles. Stars, a small flower. Sarah stopped crying, wiped her face, and began to draw her own. When her mother found her, she stood frozen for a moment, unsure what to make of the sight. But Clara simply stood, nodded once, and walked away. From that day forward, Sarah waved to her every time they passed on the road. Word spread slowly, not in gossip but in small stories passed between parents. Stories of how Clara sat with the Miller twins under the oak tree behind the church and showed them how to feel the wind through their fingers. How she spent an afternoon showing young Thomas Carter how to mend the frayed edge of a saddle strap without saying a word. Only using her hands and his eyes, she had a way of drawing attention without demanding it. The children loved her not because she entertained them or spoiled them, but because she listened, truly listened, even when they didn't know how to explain themselves. Soon, more children followed. Some came with permission, some snuck away in the early mornings to find her by the stream or near the barn. Clara never turned them away. She didn't set lessons or rules, but they learned all the same. She taught them to walk quietly, to feel the earth with bare feet, to notice which way the wind bent the grass. She showed them how to read the sky, to sense when a horse was uneasy, to hear the rhythm in a bird's call. Most importantly, she taught them to listen not just with their ears, but with their whole selves. The children began using their hands to communicate with her. Even if clumsily, they'd mimic the signs she showed them, laughing when they got them wrong, beaming when she nodded her approval. It became a kind of game, a kind of dance. The parents, at first hesitant, began to watch from a distance, and then they started asking questions. What does this mean? How do you say thank you with your fingers slowly? The signs made their way into more homes. Caleb watched it all with quiet pride. He had always known Clara was more than what the town had first seen. He had known it in the way she moved, the way she breathed, the way she tended to the world like it was something sacred. But now others were starting to see it too. The same neighbors who had once looked at her with suspicion now offered her fresh eggs, bundles of herbs, or simple thanks, not out of pity, but out of respect. Reverend Hargrove, once wary of her silence, invited her to sit near the front pew during Sunday gatherings. She never sang, never bowed her head quite like the others, but her presence softened the room in a way few could explain. The children would glance back during sermons, catching her eye, grinning when she gave them a small nod or a subtle wink. One summer afternoon, the school teacher fell ill and was unable to meet her students. Clara showed up in her place, not to teach arithmetic or recite scripture, but to sit with the children beneath the trees and let them speak. She let them draw what they felt, sign what they could, and simply exist without pressure. When the teacher recovered, she asked Clara to return once a week, not to replace her, but to remind the children that there was more than one way to learn. The town changed with her presence. People began to pause more, to listen longer, to soften their steps. Fewer arguments broke out at the post office. Neighbors helped each other without being asked. It was as if the quiet Clara carried inside her had rippled outward, touching everyone who let it in. And though she still said little, her influence echoed louder than any sermon. Even the old men at the general store, who had spent years set in their ways, began nodding in her direction, tipping their hats without being prompted. One of them, Hank, carved a bench and placed it near the edge of town, beneath the cottonwoods. On it he carved one sentence, carefully, with hands that trembled to the one who taught us to listen. Clara never sat on the bench. She preferred the grass beneath her feet, the shade of trees, the wind in her hair. But she would pass it often, and each time she did, she smiled. Years passed. Children grew and told stories of the silent woman who showed them how to hear without sound. They remembered the way she pointed to the sky just before a storm, the way she cupped her hands around a flower and made them notice its scent for the first time. And though she never became a teacher in title, everyone who learned from her remembered her that way. Clara left no journals, no lectures, no instructions. She left something far greater: understanding. She became a part of the town's fabric, woven into its rhythm, its breath, its memory. And though her voice had seldom been heard, her presence became one of the clearest legacies the town would ever know. The years passed with the soft certainty of seasons, one folding gently into the next, until time itself seemed to slow on the Monroe Ranch. Clara and Caleb didn't mark anniversaries with candles or celebration. There were no grand declarations, no need for them, for their days told the story well enough. Quiet mornings shared over a pot of coffee. Evenings spent side by side on the porch as the sun melted into the horizon. Love had long since settled into the bones of the house and the soil beneath their feet. It was in the way they moved through space together, never out of rhythm, never needing to catch up. Caleb's hair had gone gray first, the deep brown fading into silver like dusk creeping across a field. Clara's came slower, strands of white appearing at her temples like threads of frost. She still moved with grace, though her steps were measured now, more deliberate. Her hands, once nimble and tireless, had softened at the joints, but they still carried stories in every motion. Caleb's back had begun to bend, a slight curve from years of labor and weather, but his eyes remained sharp, especially when they rested on her, their home age too. Not from neglect, but from use. The wood of the porch groaned under familiar weight. The curtains were sun-bleached, the floor worn smooth by countless footsteps. In the kitchen hung pots and pans blackened with honest work, their shapes familiar as old friends. Clara still baked bread on Sundays, though now Caleb helped knead the dough. They worked slowly, together, in comfortable silence. Sometimes he would hum while she stirred, an old tune his mother used to sing. Clara didn't know the words, but she understood them just the same. They never spoke much of what came before, not out of pain, but because there was no longer any need. The past had done its work and made room for peace. The ranch, once a place of solitude, had become a sanctuary. The neighbors still visited, though less often now. The children who had once gathered at Clara's feet were grown with families of their own. They came by from time to time, bringing preserves and sketches drawn by their sons and daughters, all of whom had learned something about kindness from the woman who taught without speaking. Caleb spent more time in his chair near the window, carving small things, bird stars, the curve of a horse's neck. He left them on the mantel or the edge of the table, and Clara always found a place for them. She had started making quilts again, slow but steady, stitching bits of their life into every square. A patch of faded blue from one of his old shirts, a corner of curtain fabric from the room where she first stayed. They never said which pieces meant what. They didn't have to. On one particularly cold evening, they sat by the fire, the wind tapping lightly at the shutters. Clara brought out a bundle wrapped in soft muslin. Inside was a scarf she had been working on for months, thin, even stitches in muted earth tones. She placed it around Caleb's neck, smoothing it gently with her hands. He didn't say anything, just touched her wrist and nodded. A moment later, he reached behind the rocking chair and handed her a small wooden box. Inside was a hairpin, hand-carved and polished smooth. It fit perfectly in her hand. They still had their walks, though shorter now. Around the barn, past the apple tree where the old dog was buried, out to the ridge where the grass swayed high in late summer. Caleb held her elbow when the ground was uneven. She pointed to the clouds and signed the word for rain just before the first drop fell. He grinned every time. It was a routine, but one that still felt like discovery. Sometimes they sat without moving, the hours sliding past like slow water. Caleb would glance at her, the lines around his eyes deepening into something gentler than a smile. Clara, always aware of him, would meet his gaze and hold it, steady and unblinking. That look between them said everything more than 1,000 poems, more than any letter ever could. It said, "I see you and I am still here." In the mornings, she brought him tea in a ceramic mug he'd mended years ago. The crack still showed, but the cup held warmth just fine. He always waited until she sat before taking the first sip. She watched the steam rise, letting the silence settle between them like a blanket. Sometimes she reached for his hand. Other times she just sat close enough to feel his breath. The end, when it came, was gentle, not sudden, not cruel. One night, Caleb sat on the porch longer than usual. The blanket she had knitted pulled tight around his shoulders. Clara joined him, resting her head lightly against his. They watched the stars appear one by one. No need to speak. Later, she helped him to bed, tucked him in as he had done for her so many times when sickness or sorrow had visited. He took her hand, kissed her knuckles, and closed his eyes. In the morning, the light streamed through the window the same as always. Clara rose, lit the stove, brewed tea, and sat by his side. He didn't wake. She didn't cry. She sat with him all morning, hand in hand, heart in heart. In the days that followed, the town came quietly. They didn't speak loudly or ask for stories. They brought food, warmth, and quiet company. Clara remained at the ranch, walking slower, speaking less, but still present, still herself. She placed the scarf in a drawer, the carved box beside it. On the porch sat his chair and hers, side by side. In time, the land continued to bloom. The seasons continued to turn. Children visited again, sitting near her, drawing in the dirt, listening not for lessons, but for presence. And she gave it freely, without demand, without sorrow. Just love, just quiet, just a life still unfolding, even in his absence. A life never loud, but always steady. In the quiet bond between Clara and Caleb, we find a timeless lesson: love doesn't need to be loud to be real. In a world that often demands explanation and noise, their story reminds us that presence, patience, and understanding can speak louder than words. Clara, once seen as different, found her place not by changing who she was, but by staying true to her quiet wisdom and gentle strength. Caleb loved her not for what she said, but for what she brought into his life: peace, care, and a shared rhythm. For older adults who've lived through decades of noise and change, this story affirms the beauty of simplicity. It shows that healing and connection come not through fixing others, but through accepting and listening with the heart more than the ears. As we grow older, perhaps the greatest gift we can give and receive is to simply be present with one another, offering time, kindness, and steadiness. Like Clara and Caleb, we learn that the most enduring love stories are the ones lived quietly, every day, without needing to be told.